I spent 63 years saying yes to people who never once asked me how I was doing. Not because they were cruel, most of them weren't. They were just comfortable. And I let them get that way. My name's Arthur. I'm 82 years old. I've got a bad knee, a decent cup of coffee, and maybe more mornings behind me than ahead. So I'm not going to waste either of our time being polite about things that took me too long to figure out. There's a certain kind of tiredness that doesn't come from working hard. It doesn't come from age either, though people like to blame age for everything once you pass 70. This tiredness comes from something quieter. It comes from spending decades giving pieces of yourself away to people who never noticed they were taking anything. I didn't see it happening. That's the honest part. My wife Dorothy, God rest her, used to say I was generous to a fault. She meant it kindly, but there was always something underneath that sentence she didn't quite finish. Like she wanted to add, and one day it's going to cost you something. She was right. She usually was. I remember a Tuesday morning, about 4 years after I retired. I had this routine I loved. Coffee at 6, newspaper, an hour of nothing, just silence and the birds outside the kitchen window. It was the only hour in my day that felt completely mine. My nephew called at 6:15. Needed a ride to a car dealership 40 minutes away. Said it would only take a couple hours. I looked at my coffee going cold on the counter, and I said, "Sure, I'll be there in 20. I got home at noon, missed my doctor's appointment, ate lunch standing over the sink because I didn't feel like sitting down anymore. And here's the part I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I told myself I didn't mind. I actually believed it. That's how deep it goes after a while. You don't just give your time away. You start lying to yourself about wanting to. There are people in our lives, and most of us have at least one, probably more, who only seem to remember our phone number when something goes wrong in their world. Not bad people necessarily, just people who learned somewhere along the way that we were available, that we'd pick up, that we'd figure something out, and we taught them that. That's the part nobody likes admitting. Every time I drove across town for a quick favor, every time I lent money I knew I'd never see again, every time I said, "Don't worry about it," when I was, in fact, worrying about it, I was training the people around me to see me as someone with unlimited reserves, unlimited patience, unlimited time. At 35, maybe you have something close to that. At 82, you do not. Your energy is not what it was. Your mornings are not guaranteed the way they once felt guaranteed. And the quiet hours, the ones where you sit with your own thoughts and feel something close to peace, those hours become more precious than anything you could put a number on. I knew a woman on my street named Evelyn, widowed, like me, a few years earlier. Sweet woman. Spent 35 years raising 4 kids, working part-time, managing a household that never stopped needing her. When her husband passed and the kids were grown and on their own, she told me she finally thought she'd get to rest a little, have some time. What happened instead was that everyone discovered she was available. One daughter called every evening to talk about her marriage problems. Another needed her to watch the grandchildren 3 days a week. A son dropped by unannounced so often she stopped answering the door. And Evelyn, being Evelyn, said yes to all of it, because she loved them, and because nobody had ever taught her that love and self-erasure aren't the same thing. Last time I spoke to Evelyn, she looked exhausted in a way that sleep can't fix. That kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. I think about her when I think about why this matters. There's also a particular kind of person who brings something different into your life. Not requests exactly, more like weather. You know the ones. Every conversation is a storm report. Something's always wrong, always unfair, always someone else's fault. And they need you to agree, to validate, to sit in the discomfort with them. When you're younger, you have the energy to absorb that. You can listen to 2 hours of someone else's misery and shake it off on the drive home. After 70, something changes. It's not that you care less. If anything, you feel things more. But the recovery takes longer. A draining afternoon can ruin your next 2 days. And you start to realize that peace, actual quiet interior peace, is not something you can afford to hand over carelessly. That realization doesn't make you selfish, it makes you honest. The ones who made me feel guilty for having limits, and there were a few, would say things like, "You've changed," or "You used to be different." What they meant was that I used to be easier to use, and they missed that version of me. I'll tell you what I told myself the first time someone said that to me. I sat with it for a day, felt bad, wondered if they were right. And then I thought about all the years I'd spent being easy and asked myself what I'd gotten in return. Not from life, not from the good parts, but from those specific people who were now disappointed in my limits. Not much came to mind. The hardest part of all this, and I mean the part that took me the longest to face, wasn't the nephew who needed rides, or the neighbors who borrowed things and forgot, or even the people who filled my ears with problems and left feeling better while I sat with the weight of it all. The hardest part was me. There was a voice in my head, and it's been there since I was young, that said I had to keep being useful. That if I stopped doing things for people, I'd stop being someone worth knowing. That rest was something you earned, not something you were allowed to just take. I don't know exactly where that came from. My father was a working man who believed in keeping busy. Maybe it came from him. Maybe it came from watching my mother run herself ragged, taking care of everybody and never once complaining. Maybe it just came from being alive in a certain era, in a certain way. But that voice cost me things. It cost me afternoons I could have spent reading, mornings I could have spent being still, a quietness I kept putting off until later, always later. And then later became 80 years old and I started doing arithmetic about how much later I actually had. There's a particular cruelty in that kind of self-denial. It doesn't feel cruel while you're in it. It feels like being good, like being the kind of man your father would respect, the kind of neighbor people can count on, the kind of person who doesn't make a fuss about himself. It only looks like cruelty in the rearview mirror when you add up all the mornings you handed away and realize you can't get a single one back. I had a neighbor tell me once that saying no was selfish. I've thought about that a lot over the years. There was also a period, maybe 5 years into retirement, when I let a man named Gerald borrow my truck for what he called a weekend. Gerald lived 3 houses down, friendly enough, always waved. That weekend turned into 3 weeks. When I finally asked about it, he acted mildly annoyed, like I was the one being unreasonable. Brought it back with a dent on the passenger side and a tank that was bone dry. Thanked me and walked back to his house like we were even. I stood in my driveway for a long moment. Not angry exactly, more like tired of recognizing that scene. I'd been in it before. Different people, different objects, same basic arrangement. Me extending something, someone else assuming it was theirs to take however they liked. The people who don't respect your limits rarely announce themselves that way up front. They're usually pleasant, usually appreciative, at least at the start. It's only after a while that you notice the pattern, that the favors only flow one direction. That your schedule is always flexible and theirs never is. That when you finally say you can't, the warmth cools a little too quickly to have been entirely real. Here's what I think now. Saying yes when you mean no isn't generosity. It's a performance. You're performing kindness while quietly resenting it, which means nobody's actually getting kindness. They're getting the shell of it. And you're carrying a weight you pretended wasn't there. Real generosity, the kind that means something, only happens when it comes from a place where you actually have something to give, where you're not running on empty and calling it virtue. I'm not talking about becoming hard. I'm not talking about closing your door to the people who matter. I'm talking about something much quieter and much more difficult. I'm talking about sitting down with yourself sometime and asking honestly, not defensively, just honestly. Which of the people in your life take more than they return? Not as a way to build resentment, as a way to see clearly. Because once you see it clearly, you get to choose. And choosing, at this age, feels different than it did at 40. There's less time to waste on half-truths, less patience for performing a version of yourself that leaves you empty by 5 in the afternoon. Dorothy used to save 1 cup of coffee for herself every morning. Didn't matter what was happening, who needed what, how loud the house got. 1 cup, just for her, before the day started asking things of her. I used to think that was a small thing. I don't think it was small at all anymore. The people who stayed in my life after I started saying no more often, the ones who didn't drift away or get offended, those people turned out to be worth the most. They didn't need me to be endlessly available. They just needed me to be honest. And in return, they were honest with me. That's a different kind of relationship than I'd had with a lot of people before. Lighter. More real. I still help when I can. I still show up for people I love. But I show up because I want to, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. That's a difference that took me 80 years to feel in my bones. You can't get the years back, I know that. But you've still got today, and probably tomorrow. And if you're lucky, a good many days after that. And what you do with the quiet ones, the ones that belong to you, that matters more than most people let themselves believe. Don't give those away to people who haven't earned them. The coffee goes cold fast enough on its own.